I have been researching basically global change in wildfire for more than 25 years. And you'll see just through my talking that I study a lot of things because I have an interest in a lot of things. And I've mostly been a research scientist. So I do a lot of research, but I work at a nonprofit institution. So I have colleagues with I like diversity. I work with a lot of different colleagues. And I did have 3 years where I was a chief scientist at a wildfire focused homeowner insurance company. So I have a little bit of experience with insurance, enough to be dangerous. And so I will bring a little bit of that into my talk today. So my first question actually, how many of you are not from California? Well, we do have some Californians. All right. Okay, well, this doesn't apply to you. Because, oh, I can't make it go forward. Oh, there we go. Because I didn't grow up in California. And so growing up, I had all of these ideas about what California was, right? I had very strong images of what California meant. And so a lot of them were these good images. I mean, that's where there's the sun and the sand and the surf, and we've got the movie stars and all those gorgeous national parks. But there's also bad stuff that I associated with it. That's the place where they've got those big freeways, right? And all that traffic, and they've got earthquakes. It's kind of scary. And they have the wildfires there. So California wildfire, it's a cultural thing. Like, people associate California and fire. They go hand in hand. There's songs written about California fire, a lot of them. I have my own playlist on Spotify. There's apparently now a new TV show that has something to do with California wildfire. So wildfire is, everybody thinks about it. And so perceptions of wildfire also vary, right? And so people think, oh, good fire, beneficial fire, bringing fire back to the land, cultural burning, helping indigenous people restore their culture. But it's also seen as a bad thing. Smokey Bear is still relevant. And now, sometimes when you look at the news and you think about movie stars in California, you see pictures of their houses being destroyed by fires. This was from the Woolsey fire in 2018. And of course, we now have just had the LA fires. And this, I grabbed this from the internet, but this here is saying 70 celebrities lost their houses in this fire, right? And even worse than people losing their houses to fire, arguably so, is that the entire state is undergoing an insurance crisis. And my 25 years of studying global change and fire in California, only recently in the past few years has insurance even been something somebody would think about talking about. Now, any time of the year, you just type in insurance, fire insurance in California, and you get articles that are coming up, new articles every day about California fire insurance crisis. And the thing is that it didn't used to be a crisis. So this, up to 2017 anyway, was showing you where wildfire is in terms of injuries and fatalities, and the size of this dot shows you financial costs and losses. So people didn't think about, insurance companies didn't think about fire. But then came 2017 and 18 in California, and within 2 years and 4 single fire events, California lost more than 40,000 structures. And then the insurance companies started to pay attention, because if you look at this chart, this is showing you US-wide the losses from fire beginning in 2011, and you can see what the California wildfires did to this trend. So it's a lot. And since then, fires are affecting the insurance companies. I just doing some digging online, I came to the number that for the last almost 10 years, insurance companies are paying more in losses than they are making in premiums in California. Part of this, and an issue, something I experienced, is that the access for insurance companies to get the reinsurance they need, which is basically insurance companies have to have insurance to cover their losses. That is becoming very difficult to come by, and it's also very expensive. And Another thing that is driving up prices and premiums and hurting companies and people is that the costs for rebuilding are also skyrocketing right now. So this is US wide, but looking at catastrophe losses, and you're looking at the curve of what it costs to rebuild right now. And so, of course, all of this is being taken out on the homeowners who are experiencing unprecedented rates of non-renewals in California and otherwise, really high premiums. And one of the solutions for that is the FAIR plan in California, which is basically, it's required by law that if you cannot get insurance, you can get it through this program called the FAIR plan. The thing is you're still you're spending a lot of money for fire insurance, but you get very little minimal coverage. So you're underinsured. And that's not the ideal outcome. These charts are just looking at exposure to wildfire, cost to wildfire, non-renewals over time in California. And then just one other thing with the problem with insurance is that going through the claims process and what people who lose their houses go through is horrible. And there's also discrepancies with social vulnerability, and the people who can't even afford to live in California can hardly afford to get insurance in California. And then with all of this happening, we just a few months ago had the LA fires, 16,000 structures. And so now the insurance industry is apoplectic. There's these things coming out. These could push the system to the brink. This could be the beginning of the end. People are saying the FAIR plan is going to go belly up. And the thing, and I'm here because this isn't just a California problem, right? This is happening all across the world. I put an Oregon on here because you all are starting to have these issues with destructive wildfires. So in the next however many minutes I'm going to talk, the overall question is, well, okay, how and why is this happening? And if we're going to be addressing fire risk in a more fiery future, I contend that understanding the risk is the first step toward actually effectively addressing the risk from both an ecological perspective and from a human and social perspective. So I'm going to provide a little bit of both of these perspectives, and in between, I'm going to show you some results of some of my research where I've looked at different strategies for addressing these. And a lot of my work has been trying to identify those strategies in specific ecological contexts that can not only minimize risk to people, but can also minimize impacts to ecological systems and biodiversity. So another thing about California fire is not just a good thing, and it's not just a bad thing, it's a really complex thing. So the jargon or the words, the lexicon for fire ecology versus management, even those are very different. And then you add to the fact that to understand and address wildfire, you also have to involve all these other disciplines, from meteorology and climate to sociology and public health. And sort of going onward from there, a quote that I think is appropriate is that uniformity is not nature's way. Diversity is nature's way. And California is a global biodiversity hotspot, as are other Mediterranean ecosystems. And California is a global biodiversity hotspot in part because it has incredible environmental diversity, a diverse topography, diverse climatic conditions, many different vegetation types and plant species, land cover, land use types. And so if you look at a map of where fire occurs over and over again, over time, there's a distinctive spatial pattern that emerges. Some places tend to burn over and over again, other places don't tend to burn. And my colleague and I did some research where we actually defined 8 distinctive fire regime ecoregions in the state of California. And so fire regime, for any of you who don't know, is what we use to describe the conditions within a certain region that persist over a long period of time relative to wildfire. So it's the characteristic frequency, size, type, seasonality, intensity of wildfire that prevails in a region over time. And over time, the plants and the animals in that region develop adaptations for that fire regime. It's an ecological process. And fire regimes can vary in frequency all the way from where fires almost never happened historically to where, in a savanna, fires are happening every few years. And California encompasses a large range of these different fire regimes. And just recognizing that Oregon is also diverse. There are a lot of different fire regimes based on the gradient from inland to the coast and from elevation from low to high. And what's been happening in the last decades is that fire regimes are being altered beyond this characteristic range of variability. And they're being altered for many different reasons. But it's happening such that, for example, areas that never had fire are now having fires, and in some areas that are accustomed to and are adapted to frequent fire are not experiencing wildfires. Either way, I'm going to talk about this later, either way, an altered fire regime can have profound ecological impacts. I'll get back to this. But in California, I'm going to draw two broad distinctions. We have our dry mixed conifer forests in this dark green, which is characteristic of the Sierra Nevada. It's what people think about and talk about when they talk about fire and forests. But most of our state is actually non-forested coastal chaparral shrublands. The dry mixed conifer forests are a frequent fire system. They have lightning fire, natural fire, and they are adapted to having frequent fire that burns through the understory and recurs frequently. The chaparral shrublands, on the other hand, are adapted to very infrequent fire because human-caused ignitions are the dominant form of ignitions. Lightning is extraordinarily rare in Southern California and really in California as a whole, unless you're up in the inland high elevation areas. That's where you experience lightning. And so in the state, these regions are experiencing opposite directions of their fire regimes being altered for different reasons. So this map is a fire return interval departure map, which is basically the extent to which fire frequency is altered beyond which was there pre-Euro-American settlement. So in blue, these are areas that are burning less than they did historically, and in orange, there are areas that are burning much more than they did historically. There's a new map that covers the whole state. The oranger areas extend up into the coast, but for different reasons. So fire suppression, the story that I'm sure all of you heard about, has reduced the role of fire in clearing out the understory. But in Southern California, with our population growth and the urban expansion, we have excessive ignitions. And as I was saying, the ecological transformations, it's not a question of fire or not fire. It's a question of change in fire relative to the historical conditions to which the system is adapted. So in many forests, what's happening is they are being type converted, where the forests are converting to a different physiognomic vegetation type, shrublands. But in the chaparral shrublands in non-forested areas in California, they are rapidly converting to exotic annual grasses. So in the forests, as I've been alluding to, what's happened without fire is that there's been a lot of accumulation of dense understory. And with that happening, fire can get in there. It can reach up to the crown of the trees, which is, with low intensity surface fire that they used to have, the trees were resilient to those fires. They persisted. Now, if the fire can get up into the ladder and hit the crown of those forests, it can cause widespread mortality. And fire is burning at a higher severity than it used to, meaning it's destroying more of the above ground biomass. And this chart is just showing you a trend over time of the proportion of area in these forests that are burning at high severity. And the problem with it, and the problem with type conversion, is that with very large patches of high severity fire, you have widespread mortality of the trees, so you don't have recruitment from within, and it's farther than the dispersal distance of the trees that are on the exterior. So whatever comes in is what comes in, and it's not the forest. To understand what's happening with chaparral, you first have to understand, and there are serotinous trees that function like this too in forests, but most of the diversity of our chaparral is what you call an obligate cedar. These plants, they actually require fire for their germination. They do not recruit in between fire. They have a long-lived dormant seed bank that is cued by fire to germinate. The problem is that the very thing that enables their persistence is also which is leading to their extirpation. And that is that it takes a minimum of, usually it's 15, all the way up to 30 years after a fire for them to be able to get that seed bank back. So if a fire comes through before that 15 to 30 years, it'll kill the seed bank and it'll extirpate the species. It can't come back up. We have other fire response functional types. I'm not going to go through them, but the important thing about chaparral is that without recruitment in between fire, and really for almost all chaparral species, they don't really recruit well in between fire, and they also have really short dispersal distances. So once chaparral's gone, it's gone. Chaparral, by the way, is it's an evergreen shrubland, woody shrubland, and it does store a substantial amount of biomass. So it has a lot of ecological value. It's also one of the main reasons California is a biodiversity hotspot. Chaparral matters, despite what people say. And so something I've studied a lot, and even since my dissertation in the late 1990s, is the fact that we are experiencing a conversion to grasslands. And this is an area that converted. So when those shrubs can't recover after a fire, the annual grasses that have come in and colonized by, largely Mediterranean countries came and they brought their grasses with them, and now they're ubiquitous and they're extremely aggressive. They outcompete all the native grassland species. And anywhere you are, if you disturb the land, those grasses are going to come in. And they grow in the winter with the rains, and then they cure about this time of year, and it's big stuff, it's cheatgrass. And so you've got this big amount of vegetation that becomes extraordinarily dry. It's extraordinarily flammable. And so that, with all the humans around, begets more ignitions, which then begets more fire, which then eliminates more chaparral, and on you have what we call a grass fire cycle. And so this, I've been studying it using air photos, looking at the extent and the drivers and how it varies. The short story is it's been really extensive. This is looking at the two destructive fires in LA, the Palisades down here and the Eaton fire. And this is from a PhD student of mine who used Landsat data to look at the fractional change in herbaceous cover over time. This is the last 30 years or so. And anything in a warm orange or yellow color is where grasses have increased, which is substantial. I talk about grasslands a lot because it really is a growing issue, and a lot of people think grasses are benign, and it's not benign. The La Hyena fire in Maui was a grass fire. The Marshall fire in Colorado on, I think it was like New Year's Eve, it was in the middle of winter, that was a grass fire. Lytton, BC was a grass fire. And then just recently, I've just been going through the news, and there's grass fires destroying houses in Tulsa. There were grass fires in Miami. This was last week, I think, the grass fires in Maine. And then one last thing in terms of grass, and then I'll stop about the grass, this is preliminary results from a study I'm doing comparing Australia and California house lots. And we are looking at neighborhoods where there was a structure that was destroyed by fire compared to a neighborhood where there was no structure lost. And we've put in all kinds of explanatory variables. These are just preliminary. But the one thing that really strikes me, this is a random forest model, is that the second most important explanatory factor for the entire state of California of structure loss for both where lots and a little structures have been destroyed is the proportion of grass surrounding the structures. And most people think it's the forest, but if you look at this is a partial dependence plot. You don't need to know the technical, but basically this is showing a negative relationship. So you actually are, statistically seeing fewer structure is lost when they're surrounded by forest. There's many reasons for this, but it's provocative. And it's also not finished. Okay, so throwing in now, how do we deal with the problem from a vegetation management perspective? In the forests, and particularly dry mixed conifer forests, characteristic of many western forests, ponderosa pine forests, mechanical thinning from below to sort of mimic what fire used to do, following with prescribed fire, doing prescribed fire, cultural burns, all of this is very important, necessary, beneficial, and it has co-benefits. So in forests, it increased forest resilience to try to prevent those big trees from being killed by fire, provides ecosystem services, indigenous culture, it helps, establish their cultural practices, and it also can serve for community protection. It's a win-win when these areas that used to burn frequently. But in California, by the way, most of the structure loss isn't in the forests. Even the campfire that burned Paradise started in grass. And so my colleague and I just did a little simple experiment where we overlaid fire perimeters, fires where at least one structure was destroyed, fires where no structures were destroyed. We just overlaid it on vegetation types. And surprisingly, most of the area burned, this is an 8-year period of time, it's an older study, but most of the area burned was in shrublands, and particularly most of the destructive fires were in shrublands. So it's sort of, there is a lot of focus on doing vegetation management appropriate for forests, and it's the biggest source of investment in the statewide. And so everybody's trying to do forest treatments in California, but that's not where the structures are burning. And if you want to think about chaparral shrublands, not only is there no ecological benefit to vegetation management or prescription fire in chaparral, it's also extraordinarily ecologically detrimental. And this is because it's facilitating that type conversion to grass. We already have way more fire on the landscape than we used to. You can't find any unburned place in Southern California. So we don't need more fire. And if you mechanically remove shrubs, there's no understory in chaparral, right? You either remove it or you don't. And when you remove it, in comes the grass. That's not to say there's not a role for vegetation management. It's just something to be aware of because people like a one-size-fits-all strategy, right? Now, having strategic fuel breaks around communities or wherever firefighters deem it safe to be and strategic for protecting structures, that we sometimes would call it a resource sacrifice, but yes, that is a substantial benefit for communities, and you need it to be at least big enough and safe enough so that firefighters are safe when they're doing the good work of trying to protect us all. But also when people talk about vegetation management, they don't think about, well, we could also be investing this huge pot of money for vegetation management, maybe on these invasive species. And there are multiple ways to go about trying to get this grass problem under control. Okay, moving on. How and why is this happening? Well, climate change is usually the first thing on everybody's mind, and most people think, logically so, that climate change is monotonically increasing fire because you think, well, it's hotter, it's drier, of course there's going to be more fire. And most studies on climate-fire relationships have taken place at very broad scales, at like a statewide or Western US scale. But my colleague and I have been doing fire climate studies looking at separate ecoregions. First, we did it in the state of California. And what we found, so again, back to these forests, there is a significant statistical relationship between seasonal climatic variability and fire activity in forests in a way that is very consistent with climate change. Warmer spring temperatures, lower winter precipitation, the kinds of things, higher vapor pressure deficit, there's a significant relationship between fire and climate. But in other regions of the state, for example, in the southern chaparral ecosystems, we didn't find this direct relationship. We don't see, increased temperature increases fire activity. And it's not to say that there's no climate effect. It's just the climate effect is different, and a lot of times it's indirect. So for example, drought, which is something we experience in Southern California, can prevent regeneration. It also can cause dieback of the chaparral, which then can, because of ember flow and wind-driven fires, it can facilitate the wind or the speed of fires in a wind-driven fire. But even though we didn't find significant temperature precipitation, something that we have seen over and over again is the one climatic factor that is strongly associated with fire activity is having high prior year precipitation. And this, of course, is what happened in LA this year. We had 2 very big wet years, and they were followed by an extraordinarily dry year. Some people are calling it sequencing, right? And so another thing with climate and fire in Southern California is we've also done research that shows that the timing of the first precipitation event in the fall or the winter, because we're a Mediterranean climate and we have 6 months of drought every summer, the risk of large fires plummets after that first precipitation event. And so, of course, this is another thing that happened in LA. We usually have long, dry summers that in November, December, October is our biggest fire month because the live fuel moisture is about as low as it's going to get. The temperatures are really high. And this is one reason that climate change isn't having an effect, qualitatively speaking. We already have the worst fire conditions you could imagine in Southern California every single year. Adding a little more temperature is just not going to make it that much worse. Our fuel moisture, we're ready to explode. But, you know, there is this thing in which it allows more opportunity when that first precipitation event is delayed. It allows more opportunity for a wind-driven fire to occur. And these data, I grabbed them from somewhere, but it is showing that potentially there may be a lengthening of the season that corresponds with the season of the Santa Ana winds. So that could be one other way in which climate change could be affecting fire in Southern California, though we don't know that yet. But the point is that it's different. Climate relationships are different in different regions. And to further emphasize this point, we did a study across the entire United States, sort of the same thing. We looked at historical fire-climate relationships, seasonal climate, and we found that different regions of the United States have not only different kinds of fire-climate relationships, like one region, it might be spring temperature, another one, it might be, you know, fall precipitation. But the strength of that relationship is highly variable in different regions, where some regions there's really strong signal, others it's not. And so I asked, well, why? You know, why are some regions, you know, more climatically responsive to fire? Is fire more climatically responsive? And so I looked at a whole bunch of different factors, elevation, regular climate, blah, blah, blah. There's only one thing that was significant. And that thing was those regions with the weakest fire climate relationships had more humans in them. So it was a higher human presence. So humans can influence fires all kinds of ways. They stop them, they start them, they change the fuel. But it suggests that the human influence on fire could maybe scramble or override the influence of climate. And so we need to be talking about humans. So talking about the human, we're moving into the human context now, talking about humans. Well, one thing to illustrate an example is this outline in black. Actually, no, the outline in red was a 1964 fire called the Hanley Fire. This is in the wine country of California. This fire did not have any fatalities. There were a few structures lost. In 2017, the Tubbs fire occurred in almost identical size and location. But in 2017, that Tubbs fire, 22 people lost their lives and more than 56 structures were lost. Okay, so why was that same fire area so different in its consequence? Well, one thing you can look at is that's the population in 1964 versus the population in 2017. And this is using census data. This is low and high housing density in the decade of 1960. This is the same map in the decade of 2010 to 2020. So those areas where there weren't any houses in 1964 now had all kinds of housing in them in the more recent era. Somebody who used to be the director of the National Park Service has a quote that I often like to use. And it's not exactly true, but it's provocative. The problem is not fire, the problem is people in the wrong places. So we've got a human land use situation happening that I strongly caution all of you Oregonians to think about. And looking at house loss patterns, you know, the location of your house makes a difference. So this is the Santa Monica Mountains, fire frequency. Some areas can burn up to 12 fires in a like 50 to 70 year period, where other places not that far away haven't burned at all. So where are structures being destroyed by fire? Well, they're happening in these areas where they burn over and over again. Some places are more fire prone than others. If you put your house in that location, you're exposed to more fire. The odds of you experiencing a fire increase. We also found that not only is fire frequency highest at low to intermediate housing density, but most structures, contrary to what you hear in the news, where you hear about these massive urban conflagrations, numerically speaking, most structures are lost at a low to intermediate housing density, where there's sort of an intermix of houses and wildland vegetation, small clusters of development around the edges. And so low housing density is, in my studies where I've compared structures lost to structures surviving and asked what are the factors explaining why, the one that consistently comes out is the number one factor is housing density, and it's usually low housing density. But once, and that's because you're more likely to have a fire get to you. But once that fire gets to you, that relationship can completely switch, where high density then becomes the risk factor. So it's an important caveat, and it's something where people like to say, oh, low density housing is the problem, or no, it's high density housing is the problem. And the science says it's actually both. Once that fire gets to LA, or a place where all of a sudden you've got tightly packed houses, you can have a conflagration like we just had in LA. Another human factor is ignition source. This paper just came out last week, where we looked at, we had, I forget the start date, but it was like 1919 to 2020, ignitions and area burned by different causes of ignition over time in the US Forest Service regions across the country. And a few points came out of this. One is that different regions have different trends of different sources that are causing the most frequent fires or the most area burn. So for example, in the southern and eastern areas, arson has been always a massive factor, whereas campfires might be more important in other regions. Another important point is those sources of the most frequent fire are not always the sources of the most impactful or the most area burned. So it's important to think about which are the ignition sources that are causing the biggest impacts. And furthermore, we did statistical analysis where we looked at climate factors and housing factors explaining fire frequency and area burned in the different regions. And then we also used ignition source as a categorical explanatory variable. We found that source of ignition explains as much variation in fire frequency as housing or climate. So the source of your ignition makes a difference. And it's something that is easily and directly controllable. Speaking of winds, or speaking of human ignitions, a study we did where we looked at historical Santa Ana wind-driven fires and what explains the area burned over time in Southern California. And one thing is that 100% of Santa Ana winds are human-caused. 75% of Santa Ana wind events have no fire, and that's because to have a fire, you have to have an ignition. So it's not Santa Ana winds that are causing the fires. It's people that are active during Santa Ana winds that are causing the fires. And area burned was the most significant variable. Explain those variation was not climate or preceding climate or temperature. It was the number of ignitions that started on that day. And so this also happened in LA. It wasn't just the Palisades and the Eaton fire. There were 4 big fires that broke out on January 7th in these incredible Santa Ana wind gusts. And so firefighter resources are stressed. You know, it's hard enough to just respond to one of these fires. But typically during Santa Ana wind days, you know, there are multiple fires breaking out because Santa Ana winds are not only fast winds, but they also really bring the relative humidity down. So just a little bit again on LA, it's on everybody's minds. This is sort of still on the ignitions theme. This is the winds on January 7th, and this is the direction of where the winds flow for Santa Ana winds. They come from the northeast, they flow down to the southwest, and they typically come in certain corridors. Now I'm putting the ignition locations for the 2 destructive fires in LA. Now you can see it relative to the city of Los Angeles and the fire perimeters. These fires happened at the interface. There was nothing that anybody could have done to stop what happened. You had these wind gusts, you had these ignitions that started right there, and in almost no time, they're casting embers well into the Los Angeles city. So it all of a sudden became an urban conflagration. And so, you know, a lot of blame has gone around about, oh, we didn't have enough vegetation management, or it was the water. And there, you know, it was just a really unfortunate correspondence of a bunch of factors that lined up together in space and time. Yeah, so this is just looking at the houses that were destroyed. It turned into an urban conflagration. Older houses, structure to structure spread, lots of embers. Embers are known to fly kilometers or more ahead of the fire front in wind conditions. Once embers reach the urban environment, wildland fuels are no longer relevant. So I'm now going to finish just talking a little bit about different solutions from the human perspective. One that I've been talking about for a long time, and people used to think I was absolutely insane to even bring the topic up, is land use planning. We can't change where the existing homes are. And in California, we've got homes all through the wildland urban interface. In Oregon, you don't. And so we've done simulation projects where we've looked at taking the exact same number of houses, putting them on the landscape under different scenarios of either purchasing private land for acquisition or having different zoning types of policies. And then we simulated 30 years into the future and with all these new houses in these different arrangements and locations. So if you have a zoning policy that focuses on infilling existing development, you have the lowest projected fire risk to structures. If you have leapfrog development where you're going out into new areas, you have the worst overall landscape risk to structures in your community. You're also creating a much larger footprint of development on the landscape, biodiversity. And we also found that conservation decisions could indirectly displace development into areas that are more fire safe. We found that areas where there's high species richness and high fire hazard in Southern California are correlated in space. And so if you put your homes in areas that aren't in those locations, you can also lower your overall risk. I'm sure you guessed I'd talk about ignition prevention. We've also done studies where we used modeling to look at using historical ignition points by cause. Different types of ignition sources have unique spatial patterns on the landscape and unique timings. So if you understand these, you could use that information to help you develop programs. And Buttrey and Prestamon, for example, they came up with this schematic of different sources of ignition and different strategies you could potentially use for those sources of ignition. So it's something I hear a lot is, oh, you can't stop ignitions, they're everywhere. But you know, some of the work of these 2 authors have shown that prevention techniques can actually help. So, you know, most homes don't burn because the fire marches right up to your house and burns it down. Most houses are destroyed by windborne embers. And so this brings me to, I'm sure, what you've all heard about by now, which is The importance of safety at the location of your structure, the home ignition zone. So of course that includes factors relative to your house, your structure, and factors relative to your property, and particularly the area that is closest to your structure, because embers like to accumulate right around here, and then they can cause a spark. If they land on something, it starts a spot fire, then it ignites your house. And so I've done research on the relative importance of different components of both of these strategies. Our research and others have found that overall structural characteristics have a much larger and significant effect on reducing the probability your house will be destroyed, particularly those things that you would think are associated with embers. So having any kind of opening or gap, using fine mesh screens to close gaps, having open eaves allows embers to get up in there. Window panes are super important. So different types of structural characteristics can have relatively different impacts. Defensible space, we found no significant additional protection, actually beyond about 60 feet, but we say 100 feet for firefighter protection. So especially in that area right around your house is really important. But another thing in terms of if you're thinking about balancing fire risk reduction with conservation, a study, for example, in Australia came out and they showed that the way you're arranging the woody vegetation in your garden, or whether or not you irrigate it, provides as much benefit as removing vegetation. Another study showed that lightly irrigating native vegetation significantly reduced hazard. And something that we've been talking about a lot is this notion of ember catchers. So, you think about a windborne ember and you think about a green, healthy tree. If that ember lands in the tree and it intercepts it, that high moisture might put the ember out and prevent it from actually landing and getting to your structure. So this needs a lot more study, but it's something that a lot of people are recommending. More is more, and you need to go out and you need to clear all that woody vegetation. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that maybe you don't need to do that. And in the process, you're also, conserving the carbon on your landscape, you're conserving biodiversity, and you're making the place look nicer. Okay, insurance. I have a couple more minutes. I've put this in, I've framed this sort of in a good, bad, and ugly thing. So I'm just going to go with it. So insurance can be good. It provides financial protection after you lose your house, right? We all need that. The bad is that, as I've told you, the industry is losing the capacity to actually provide this protection. And the ugly is that it's resulting in non-renewals and prices that, not even the movie stars can afford. So one thing good that insurance companies could do is they could help to incentivize more people to do fire safe practices. So if you get an insurance credit, you're actually gaining something and you're also making yourself safer. The bad is that oftentimes the companies aren't actually doing that. They're not giving credit where it's due. But the worst thing is that I've known companies who are saying, well, you need to clear the 300 feet of all of your woody vegetation or we're canceling your policy. That's not based on science, and it's significantly harming the homeowner. And so I consider that the ugly. The good. Insurance, ultimately, if it's using accurate models and pricing, it could start to disincentivize people living in hazardous areas because it's cheaper to get insurance in a fire-safe place. The bad, so far that hasn't happened. There's building happening in California in any kind of place you can imagine. But then the ugly is that even if they wanted to do that, still, because insurance has not always been fire-focused, the models are not very good. And so even if they wanted to, they might have models that are wrong, that are then incentivizing people to live in fire-safe places, fire-dangerous places, just because the model was wrong. So all this needs to be addressed. So this is my summary slide, and I think there's a little time for questions. So what are the main points? Environmental diversity is really important in any conversation about wildfire because there are diverse fire regimes. And any kind of alteration to your fire regime regardless of whether it's high or low, can disrupt ecological systems. And it also changes the effects and effectiveness of how you're managing the vegetation, which is the main way people deal with fire. It's something that is visible and you can do, and so people do a lot of it. And fire regimes aren't changing off for the same reason. It's not just the suppression story, it's not just the land use story, it's different in different places. But climate is really important, but you know, aside from going out and doing all the mitigation we need to do to stop climate change, human influence on fire is something that is a little bit more tangible that we could do something about. We could change land use. People talk about it more than they used to. And we can change ignitions. We can also change invasive species. So there are certain things that we can do from a human influence perspective that aren't tackling climate change. And so finally, there are some solutions out there where you could have mutual benefits. Ignition reduction, especially in places where there's too much fire. I've talked about land use planning. Homeowner mitigation that uses appropriate defensible space without going overboard. And then something that all of us and all of you can do is educate and communicate about what the science shows and not what people believe, or you know, that it's not a one size fits all situation. And I think that's it. Oh. Well, I know in the East Coast, there used to be a lot of debris burning, and there used to be a lot of campfires. And they put policies in the parks, and they put controls on debris burning, and it significantly reduced those ignitions. They're pretty controllable because debris burning is a pretty obvious source of fire. Campfires, they're spatially constrained to certain locations. Education can help with that. Arson is a lot trickier. I mean, sometimes I have a colleague, David Bowen, who talks about fire terrorism. Like sometimes people, they're actually looking for those Santa Ana wind conditions because they know it's going to have the worst effect. But, you know, there are stiff penalties for that. And lately I've been talking about when there's red flag days, you know, in your fire safe council where you have a community working together, maybe you should also have people patrolling and looking out to make sure that there aren't any activities going on, because that's when you really need to control. Yeah, okay, so he was talking about how historically, and I have something for you, historically in California, the pricing was controlled such that insurance companies were not allowed to increase prices based on a model showing the spatial difference in risk. You had to use historical prices so that it was a protection for consumers. So all of a sudden, some model doesn't skyrocket your price because it says you're at high risk. And there's been a lot of controversy about that policy. And just a couple months ago, the state has changed that. Now, insurance companies are allowed to use models. Actually, one nice thing of that is that if they have their model approved for just being a relatively decent model, which many aren't, they have to provide at least some insurance to underserved communities. So that's a little bit of a pay-in to the ability to use the model. Now, whether ultimately using the models is going to then create a risk that's more commensurate with where the risk actually is open for debate. But it at least allows the potential for that to start happening. Yeah, so she's asking about, you know, what was the main catalyst, or what is it that brought about these 2017 and 18 fires? And the answer is it's sort of similar to LA. I mean, you just have a lining up of things all at once. And, you know, there were some really anomalous, you know, humidity conditions in 2018 for the Camp Fire. They were both like very strongly wind-driven fires. And I mean, once again, there was an ignition. And it's sort of, I didn't really mention this, but another thing to really think about is, you know, certain regions have certain characteristic wind directions. And so when you're thinking about how do you control or what do you look for, it's that ignition in between your asset and where the wind is coming from is the one that's the one to worry about most, because that's where the ignition starts. The wind carries it into what you're trying to protect. But yeah, I mean, there's probably a climate change signal. But a lot of people talk about how climate change is just exacerbating a situation that already exists. Because the thing is that there are now so many houses located in fire-prone places. The fires that didn't used to be burning houses, we just didn't think about them anymore, or think about them. But now that they're burning houses, we're thinking about them, and that's because the houses are there. So he is talking about how y'all here in Oregon, you had the 2020 fires, and then the response to that was, let's put out a map that shows where, at the parcel level, where the hazard is highest. And that map has now twice not been well received. So what is my opinion of those types of maps? I am very critical of fire hazard maps because they're all wrong, but some are better than others. California has its own set of maps. They're called the fire hazard severity zones. And they have not been rejected like you guys have rejected yours. And maybe it's because they are not supposed to be used for specific land use planning decisions. They are a broad-based map showing you where hazard is higher than another area, and they are used to set policy for defensible space and for building codes. So if you're located in a fire hazard zone, you then have to, by law, put in 100 feet of defensible space. If there's new construction, you have to build it up to a code. That kind of works for California, and maybe it works because it's not saying, hey, your house is going to catch fire. And so the insurance company goes and they raise your premium. And my skeptical nature is saying, well, is that house really that at risk? Did you use multiple models for this, or how did you create this map? So I don't know. I think maps can be useful, but for everybody's sake, maybe they shouldn't be so resolved to convey a sense of artificial precision, because you just can't get that precision in them. So she's asking about how I said prescribed fire and management in chaparral ecosystems is not recommended, and whether there is vegetation management and that kind of stuff in chaparral, and are people using it for invasive species? And I will say that there is, quite unfortunately, a ton of money slated for managing chaparral shrublands. I have a talk with the California Coastal Commission on Monday because they've been asked to remove all of their very sensitive maritime chaparral in Big Sur coast in the name of fire safety. California has also, by the way, just created a thing where they've cleared any fire project that helps public safety from any kind of environmental review for the rest of the year. So it doesn't matter if it's chaparral or anywhere else. If you have a fuel break and you want to put it in, you can do it and you don't have to go through review. And so that there are people doing some fires in cheatgrass, and I think there's also things like goats. People talk about goats are controversial, right? But I think in the right place, in the right time, it's an option. And I would much rather see people dealing with this grass problem, where it's really a problem, than trying to use a paradigm from forests and apply it to a place where it's not going to have that effect. This is an important thing because there are some perennial grasslands left, and I'm in a project in Santa Cruz, the same thing. Like, there are very, very valuable, ecologically speaking, grasslands, and they're just outcompeted by the invasives. And I don't know what the answer is, but they're trying like different seasons. Targeted herbicide is not out of the question. So I think it's also
Nature Conservancy was using ostomate to make little blobs that would have the native seeds surrounded by some nutrients. And then they were dropping them, I think, in drones to give them a head start.
Wow. So, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, it's an area of ongoing research, but I'm just glad people are even considering it. So I keep forgetting that. I think everybody can hear. He's asking about firefighting and dealing with these new wind-driven fires that are threatening communities, if that's changed the way firefighters have had to operate dealing with these winds. I would say that firefighting has changed overall. to the point where it used to be fighting fires in the wildland in the backcountry, and now almost all of it is structure protection. As more development expands into the WUI, firefighters are having to go to different places, trying to save just one house. When the wind conditions are what they're like in the Santa Ana or other really strong wind, it is really unsafe for firefighters to be there. And there's, quite frankly, not a lot they can do, which is why fuel breaks don't work, in wind-driven fires. Embers are going to cross them. They're going to jump a 10-lane freeway, and putting your firefighter there in front of that fire is not recommended. So the best they can do is go to houses, and this is where having good access, good vehicular access to your community, and having some kind of strategic road or fuel break, or when houses are, they have appropriate defensible space. I've heard stories where that then gives firefighters more of an incentive to go in and try to save at least some houses, knowing, sometimes they look over there and they're like, we can't. So they focus on what they can do. And it's a pain. Imagine having to make that choice. Who do you save? But a lot of times it comes down to who can you save? So, I don't know firefighting, but a lot of people wanted to blame the firefighters and the water and everything for LA, and that really should not be the main point of conversation. He's asking about utility companies, and of course, utilities have been responsible for, dare I say, most of the destructive fires in California. They're also responsible for a lot of the ones in Australia. So he's asking about what are they doing? And I actually happen to be on the California Wildfire Safety Advisory Board, who oversees and provides recommendations to the utility companies in the state. So I have a bit of an inside view that indeed they're all freaking out, but they of course passed their rates increasing, the lawsuits are reflected in the rates. They are, they're really creating more wildfire mitigation plans. They're investing a lot of money. One thing I think that could be good is that they're putting a lot of weather stations all over the place. And so that's allowing a much more finely resolved way of looking at where the conditions are worst. And so, as you mentioned, the utility companies do something called public safety power shutoffs, where if the weather conditions are a certain way, they just shut the power off, and that then prevents a utility. It's not always popular for the people who are losing power, but it's something that they do. And so I think these weather stations, they're also putting some remote cameras out there, which can help with situational awareness, like, oh, we can see the fire and get it before it escapes control. So I think they're doing some stuff, but I don't know if they're doing everything they need to be doing. So yeah, it's definitely something that is part of the current dialogue that I hadn't thought to think about or talk about anyway.